Good evening from Riobamba in Ecuador. I'm on my way back really from the Sierra, staying the night in Riobamba, from 5 days away in this different part of Ecuador. And I mention that because it's contrasts with the Ecuador that I mostly have some kind of view of. So I want to explain how that all comes about, and to do that I need to explain something about, well, why I have the link with Ecuador, what brought me here. Because this last week is such a contrast with what I normally experience. This last week is the only occasion in which I meet other tourists, other visitors, other foreign people visiting. So I've been up in the Sierra, where I've met a whole succession of lovely young people, all on gap years or career breaks, exploring South America or the world. And here in Riobamba, it's a very different kind of city to the ones I mostly encounter in La Costa. It's historic, it's beautiful, it's a bit more touristic. Not that I've seen many tourists on this occasion. I've just been here through the day. And yeah, it's the kind of place I would kind of want to bring my family and friends to, which I don't think I could say of all the places I visited in Ecuador at all. But it's not the Ecuador that I'm mostly experiencing through my times in Ecuador. So I need to explain why, really. And the reason for that is because my link with Ecuador is through the Anglican Church. That came about because when I first had a sabbatical in 2004, I walked the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. One of the sort of legacies of that was it gave me a real bug that I wanted to learn Spanish. Started to do so seriously in 2005. And as a result of that, a few years later, perhaps in about 2008, I used a bit of holiday, went to Salamanca, signed up for a sort of intensive Spanish course, and found accommodation in a hall of residence, mostly used by university students, which happened to be run by the small Spanish-speaking Anglican Episcopal Church in Spain. The warden there and his wife, Jose and Mercedes, were Ecuadorian, kind of economic refugees really from an Ecuador which at the time was economically even worse than it is now. So they'd gone to Spain like many other Ecuadorians just to earn some money, and were working all hours, saving and scrimping in order to build themselves and their family a house back in Ecuador. So I met them and kept in touch, saw them another couple of times on other visits to Spain when they were doing similar work, just garnering the euros to send back home. By the time I next had a sabbatical in 2016, they'd gone back to Ecuador, and Jose was ordained as an Anglican deacon. So that gave me that link, gave me a reason to go to Ecuador, which I did. Spent 7 weeks there then. I visited again in 2019, but by then Jose and Mercedes had moved. Although he was working almost full-time as a deacon, looking after churches, doing remarkable work, he wasn't getting paid anything. There was no money, so it wasn't sustainable long-term. So he then managed to get a job as a deacon, working full-time in a bilingual Episcopal church in the US, in New Jersey. And he was then subsequently ordained a priest there, and is still working there and doing a great job. But I then formed, the link was more than just through Jose, and so that link continued, and I went again in 2019. And then in 2022, as some of you know, some of you helped, we were able to help pay for Carlos and Gina to visit us in Branksome. And now in 2024, my third visit to Ecuador is part of a further sabbatical, my next sort of sabbatical period. So it's the Anglican Church that's been my sort of entree into Ecuador and my base. So my experience is formed through the Anglican communities. And the Anglican Church here is, as you'd expect, fairly small, as part of a national picture, but I would guess in the diocese, there are two dioceses. The diocese that I'm familiar with, covering La Costa, La Litoral, there are about, I'm sure they could tell me if I asked, but I would guess about 20, maybe 22 or 24 churches in all, each with their congregation. There are only 9 salaried clergy, plus a bishop. So that's my link. And it just so happens that all those churches are in poor areas, poor neighbourhoods. I've still got my hat on. My distinguished looking or absurd Panama hat, you take your pick. They're all in poor communities, really poor. The very first Anglican Church, they think, back in the 40s or 50s, was formed by a sort of small Brit community of people working with a big Esso or Shell petrol refinery in La Libertad. They formed a church in their special Brit community where there's a Queen Elizabeth Drive and things like this. There's no Brits there anymore, I don't think, but the marks of their previous occupancy of the place is very clear in a place called Ancon. Well, that church closed long ago, but it maybe that stimulated the thought and people began to think, oh, the Anglican Church is a possibility, is a thing. But most of the Anglican churches, as far as I can make out, have their origins in sort of around the 70s or 80s. And why those 20 or however many churches are where they are is various accidental factors, and there are sort of slight, little groups of them, satellites of them almost, where one probably led to another one being formed. So there are 3 or 4 in Los Rios, sort of central area where Gina cares for those churches and does remarkable work. There's several in Manta and around. There's now several in recent years arisen around La Libertad. There's several in Guayaquil. There's just the one in Quevedo. They're all in poor areas. And when we're talking poor, we're talking, by my standards, by most of the standards of people I know in England, very poor. To put that in context, if you have a proper job in Ecuador with a salary, a contract and everything, so teachers, full-time employees of shops, pharmacists, so forth, civil servants, then you'll be on the state minimum salary. It's pretty well universal. It's what most people get if they've got a proper job at all. And that's $460 a month, which you can live on here, and people do, with care, live quite well. But you are still poor, and where you live is going to reflect that. It's going to be in the poor areas. And bear in mind, most people don't have salary jobs at all, and most people, do a few hours here, a day there where it's available, or make things, buy things, sell things. And just the number of street vendors is an illustration of that. And of course, those forms of income are likely to be a lot less than that minimum salary, and a lot less secure. So that's the situation for most of the Anglican, where most of the Anglican churches are, and that's therefore the Ecuador that I encounter. And probably the Anglican church, for most people, is either a chief help to establishing a securer and stabler way of life, or even a way of improving, sort of becoming upwardly mobile. Even that's not the preaching, and that's not the ambience of the churches, but because they encourage education, they encourage responsibility, they encourage mutual care, they encourage a little bit of self-examination and repentance and so forth, then yeah, there are some remarkable life-changing stories and testimonies I've heard from people for whom the church has actually been life-changing. It's because poor communities, it's bizarre, isn't it, but we all know it's the case, poor communities are often very vulnerable to things like drugs, alcohol, abuse, physical abuse within families and in relationships and so forth, crime, of course. So, yeah, a number of people I've heard in the congregation at Libertad who will say, their life and the life of their families have been transformed because through coming to the church, through coming to the gospel, through the church, they've been able to come to terms with their own lifestyle and been able to address problems, particularly alcohol, drug, violence, crime related. But those communities are poor, and people who form the Anglican Church are, part of them. So that they're vulnerable in terms of healthcare, vulnerable in terms of crime, and the places are wonderful, close-knit, supportive, wonderful places and communities, but they're poor, they're noisy. It's not going to be easy to get good education. Just to give an example, most people live in single-story, single kind of sort of one little block is then partitioned off, and because there's no air conditioning, usually they have kind of like open space on the ceilings, so they're kind of partitioned off rather than separate rooms to allow a bit of air circulation. And you probably don't have windows; you'll have sort of mosquito wire to let the air in, and so they're often very noisy, really are noisy, and either internally in terms of the houses themselves, or externally, the neighbours, the noise, the motorbikes, the music, the whatever, cockerels crowing, and so forth. So came to know a bit better this time a lovely young 22-year-old. She's also part of the seminary group, who's at university doing quite a long course. University is free here, thank goodness, although often the standard is not high, apparently. But as a result of that course, she hopes to be a teacher, she hopes to be on that minimum salary, therefore, and that will be a considerable step up for her family. Her mother and she herself, when she can, when there is work, when it's in season, has work by the day with a banana processing plant. And it means being picked up by some sort of van or something at about 5 in the morning, getting back about 9 at night, and the pay for that will be something like $12 or $15. That's when it's available. So, and they live in that sort of house. In their case, there's only 3 of them. It's daughter, mother, and grandmother. In most cases, it's going to be more than 3 of them. And there's just one section, which is the bedroom, and there's not room for 3 beds, even if they had 3 beds. There's the mum and daughter share one bed, grandmother the other one, and that's the house is immaculate and beautiful life is lived, but it is poor, and therefore my experience of Ecuador is mostly formed by those communities, and I have to say I find it quite challenging at times, but also extraordinarily moving and inspiring at times as well. But that's why my view of Ecuador, that I'll share in these kind of videos, is different to the one that perhaps most tourists will encounter, and also the one that the middle class, because the middle class just doesn't exist in those communities. They obviously do exist in Ecuador, but I guess they're mostly in the sort of gated communities elsewhere that you see. Anyway, meanwhile from Riobamba, next to the bus station, hoping to get some sleep, I wish you lots of love from Ecuador, and let me know if you like this and find it interesting, and I'll do a bit more. Ciao.